My name continues to be Rebecca Nugent, and I'm the head of the Department of Statistics and Data Science here in the Dietrich College of Humanities and Social Sciences at Carnegie Mellon. And a very, very warm welcome to all of you for today's event. If you are new to Carnegie Mellon campus, if you're joining us, we know we have some people who have come here for the draft, and they're kind of kicking off their draft visit with us. Very warm welcome to you as well. Please let us know if you have any questions about Carnegie Mellon or about the Sports Analytics Center or the Department of Social and Decision Sciences. We're happy to show you around. So one of the reasons why I wanted to mention that we are part of the Dietrich College of Humanities and Social Sciences is that Carnegie Mellon, you hear a lot about CMU with respect to humanity and technology. And the NFL draft is in town, you may have heard. And we did an awful lot of technology this morning. We had an AI and sports showcase down at our Hazelwood Green facility where we looked at lots of startups that are working in the AI sports area. We also showcased the Carnegie Mellon Sports Analytics Center. But it was a lot about technology, thinking about kind of that robotic innovation angle. And what's really important is to show the flip side, the humanity side, and that is, I think, what this event is really focused on. We can do all of the wonderful kind of modeling associated with kind of thinking about draft predictions. We can build machine learning models. We can do all of that, but we need to think about the behavioral side of the house, and that's what tonight's event is all about. So focusing much more on the humanity plus technology today. So we're very excited to have a really good panel with us, and I'm going to turn it over to my colleague to talk a little bit more about the behavioral economics side, the current head of social and decision sciences, Gretchen Chapman. Thank you.
Thanks, Rebecca, and welcome everyone. We're so happy to see you here. My name is Gretchen Chapman. I'm the head of the Department of Social and Decision Sciences. We study decision science and behavioral economics, looking at real-world decision-making in lots of applied arenas like football. And I want to acknowledge that this talk is part of the Hilliard Family Behavioral Economics Lecture Series, made possible through a generous gift from David Hilliard, who is joining us as part of the Zoom audience. So I hope you enjoy today's event, and I'm going to turn things over to Professor Ron Yurko, the Director of the Sports Analytics Center.
All right, thank you, Gretchen, and thank you, Rebecca, for kicking us off. And thank you all for joining us here tonight. I'm very excited to introduce our featured speaker for this event. Cade Massey is a practice professor at the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School, where he's the faculty director of the Wharton People Lab and the co-faculty director of the Wharton Sports Analytics and Business Initiative. He received his PhD from the University of Chicago and was faculty at Duke and Yale prior to joining Wharton in 2012. He is also a fantastic co-host of the Wharton Moneyball podcast, a wonderful sports analytics podcast, and I'm not just saying that because I've been a guest multiple times on the show. But Cade is an ideal speaker for this Dietrich College event, working at the intersection of academia and industry, really bridging the gap between research and the actual practice of decision making. His seminal work from 2013 on the NFL draft with Richard Taylor, titled The Loser's Curse, really changed the discourse on how teams value picks in the draft. And so now I will bring up Cade here, turn it over to him to answer the question, has the loser's curse been broken?
Thank you, Ron. Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Gretchen. Much appreciated. Is the mic okay? I'm delighted to be here. SDS has a legendary role in my mind and my development. It was a group I heard about as a graduate student at the University of Chicago. Faculty here I've been reading since I was a baby academic. Robin Dawes, Baruch Fischoff, George Lowenstein, Linda Babcock. These were legendary figures in my training. And more recently, Carnegie Mellon Sports Analytics Group has become a beacon in my professional life. I run a similar group. We like to think of ourselves as a similar group anyway. That's a high bar to meet. You guys really are setting the gold standard in sports analytics, and you're making contributions that improve my life. And so it's a delight to be here at the intersection of SDS and the Sports Analytics Group. I will say, I think you might have missed an opportunity. I know y'all have gone to a lot of trouble for the draft, and you've added some elements and you've boosted the profile. But given the explosion of analytics and modeling in particular in sports, and given the foundational role that Robin Dawes played, I think he might deserve a little more attention at exactly this moment. And what do we do for big figures who make big contributions in sports? We give them statues, right? We give Dawes statues. So my modest proposal is for one of the stadiums around here. I don't care really which one. So my modest proposal is something like this. We managed to get the liking reasonably well. We've got an American Psychological Society tag on him. That's Robin. And this is really an event that he has provided foundational. It's different. What's happening tomorrow in Pittsburgh is different because of Robin Dawes. I want to acknowledge up top also that the GM's job over the next few days is staggering. And those of us who watch them and critique them and comment on them endlessly need to acknowledge how difficult that task is. So we usually talk about their picking the right player. And that is the core activity of the draft. But it's not really sufficient to think about just picking the right player. They're certainly thinking about something broad. They have to pick the right 7 or 12 players in the draft. And what you do on one pick is going to affect what you can do on the other picks. And so you really have to evaluate the portfolio. So already we have to broaden from one pick to the whole 3 days. Most of us don't think of it that way. But then that's not the job either. He has to pick the right 53 players for this year's roster via draft, free agency, and retention of his own team. And so he has to think about, if I take a tackle here, I'm going to have to get a linebacker through free agency. And he has to think about these multiple channels and the different distributions of talent. So that's a harder optimization problem. But that's not even quite it yet, because he has to pick the right 53 players this year while not overly restricting his ability to pick the right 53 players for next year. This is the optimization problem. It's probably more complicated than this. But this is the layered, nested challenge that these guys face. And I just want to acknowledge it because nobody has that optimization problem written down. The best team in the league doesn't have that one written down. Teamworks doesn't have that one written down that I know of. And at the heart of this core issue of choosing the right player, there's an extraordinary amount of uncertainty. These are data from a different, not the main project I'm going to talk today, but we worked with the team with all of their scout grades. And what we were trying to do is ask, can we mechanically aggregate the grades? And so I won't talk about that in detail, but I want to share the basic data that we were working with. This is all the team's grades over a 12-year period. And the grades run B through L. We've camouflaged the actual grades here. And what I want to show you is the outcome for every player that was given one of those grades, what eventually happens to that player on the y-axis, as measured by the share of cap, the share of salary cap they receive when they reach free agency. So when you first draft a player, his contract is bargained low, it's restricted. 4 or 5 years later, he reaches free market, and that's when his real value is realized, and we observe that through the cap. This is a measure that many teams use as well. So this is what we found when you looked at what grade a player got and then what happens over time. So what do you see in those data? One, there's a lot of folks that get, the lower buckets are used more and the bad outcomes are realized more. That's one thing. What else do you see? The higher buckets have higher means. The red bar is the average cap value of those players. And so it's ordered properly. There's information in the grades that the players get from the scouts. But the main thing that I take from this picture is the enormous uncertainty, the wide variance that happens at every level. We're talking about even a bucket that is as sparsely populated as B, very few players get it. You'd think that, man, if they get that, they're going to be locks, right? They're not locks. Take a bucket down. Next to highest, still an elite grade from a scout. This is a very sharp team that's providing these grades. And we still have a bunch of zeros, players that don't even make a second contract. So this is the uncertainty at the heart of the draft. And so again, we have to recognize this is something they have to navigate. This is fundamental to what we're trying to do, what we need to do in the draft. And despite this uncertainty, teams prize the right to choose first and to choose earliest. You might think in that much uncertainty, let's just let someone else pick, but they pay greatly for the right to pick. We observe that through the market prices for draft picks. This is the first part of the Massey-Thaler paper that Ron referred to. This is the price of every pick in the draft as a function of the top pick in the draft. And we fitted this curve to all the trades that we observed over a wide period of time, and it's extremely well-behaved market. The prices cohere very closely to this curve, and it's a very steep change in price. What this says is that by the time you get to the bottom of the first round, the 32nd pick, the value of that pick and what it can get in other picks is 1/4 of the first pick in the draft. So another way to think about it, you might trade the top pick for 4. You can't quite do this, but you could theoretically trade the top pick for 4 of the 32nd pick. This says that teams really value the right to choose high. And we were curious if that was justified. You'd like to, a market should, the price of an asset should reflect the value of holding that asset. And that's essentially what we investigated. What we found, in fact, is that the top pick is the least valuable pick in the first round. At least it was when we published our paper in 2013. This is that same trade curve, and then we graph on top of it the value of actually picking a player with those picks. And we found this very unusual shape. You would expect it to follow the same shape. In fact, ideally, it would be the exact same curve. But in fact, it not only doesn't go down, it goes up. At the top of the draft, it goes up, because even though the performance value declines, the players chosen later aren't as good as the players chosen earlier, the compensation cost of paying those players declines even more steeply. So you have to pay a lot for those top players. And it means that the first pick in the draft is the least valuable, as long as you use it, it's the least valuable of the 32 picks in the first round. And this is what we call the paper the loser's curse. The NFL gives the worst team from the year before the first pick in the draft. And we saw this curve, and we thought, well, it's not a winner's curse, it's a loser's curse. The worst team gets stuck with this pick. And it was considered at the time blasphemous. There's been a fair bit of research since, mostly done by people like folks working at Carnegie Sports Analytics Group, showing that this is the shape of this thing. We wanted to dive in and see if it's changed. We're interested in this problem not just because we're interested in football, but because it reflects a bigger problem. Michael Lewis, when he was talking about his Moneyball, his famous Moneyball book, which was about baseball, he had written that after studying presidential politics. And he said some people gave him a hard time, like, why are you looking at baseball? After studying presidential politics, he says that professional baseball players whose achievements are endlessly watched, discussed, and analyzed by tens of millions of people can be radically misvalued. Who can't be? If such a putatively meritocratic culture as professional baseball can be so sloppy and inefficient, what can't be? So this is our motivations. If we're overvaluing personnel in this domain, we're likely misvaluing personnel in other domains. So what's changed? I'm going to give you updates today in 3 flavors. Bad news, good news, and the same news. 2 pieces of information, 2 updates from both of those. And these are going to come from new work that Thaler and I have done with Chris Avery, are doing still. Chris Avery is an economist at Harvard, and Kevin Mears, a TeamWorks colleague from Karim, who we'll hear from in a bit. Okay, so first the bad news. The bad news is about the chart. So the chart is this pricing of draft picks. And it's the chart in quotes because everyone knows what chart. Sometimes it gets called the Jimmy Johnson chart. Sometimes it gets called, in shorthand, Jimmy. And it's this chart that was created by the Dallas Cowboys shortly after Jerry Jones bought them in 1989. Jimmy Johnson was the coach. And early on in our work, we worked with the Cowboys, and they said, well, we know the guy who created that chart. You can talk to him. So we did an interview. Mike McCoy was Jerry Jones's oil and gas business partner. And when he first bought the Cowboys, he was a minority owner. Jones eventually bought him out. But in talking with Johnson, they realized they wanted the prices of these trades. They knew that trading wasn't as popular, but it was happening. And McCoy was an engineer, he said, I can figure that out. And so we found 40 trades that had taken place between 1987 and 1990. And he just fit a curve that rationalized those trades, that equated the buckets of picks that were exchanged in those 40 trades. And he told us, he said, it gave us more confidence. If you just had a sticker, bread is 49 cents, everything would be easier. He said, until then, people had been sort of afraid to trade. But he also said, our coaches started getting hired away. They'd always ask for the chart and take it with them. So it propagated through the NFL. And eventually, we had started estimating this market before we knew it existed. Eventually, it started showing up on ESPN and being published. Vitally, these trades that the chart was based on came from an era that was completely different economically from what we're in now. There was no salary cap. The salary cap came in 93 or 94, and there was no free agency. And so teams could pay anything they wanted, and if they drafted a player, they more or less had the player for his life. And that's a very different economic environment that we're living in now. This is what we found when this is the chart. So we didn't find this. We learned later the chart existed. This is the chart from Johnson or Mike McCoy or the chart. And it's very steep. It's very similar to what we found when we estimated our own. The only difference here is that the solid line is the actual chart. It's kind of piecewise linear. You can see it deviates there, but we can drop an exponential, a Weibull right on top of it. And then here we come, Massey-Thaler, and what we discover is that the market had started flattening some. It's a little less steep, seemingly a little less crazy in the period in the 17 years or so following the chart. And that's kind of where we start from now. We came to this a couple years ago, started working on it again, curious how things had changed. I had sat with this knowledge for years, and I just assumed it was going to continue to flatten out. That they would learn that it was so uncertain that they shouldn't be pricing these things the way they are, and they would see a continued evolution. I believe in learning, and that we continue to evolve in a little more rational direction. But instead, what we found is it snapped right back to Johnson-McCoy. I mean, right on top of it. And if you look at the residuals, they've gotten tighter over this 20-year period of time. The prices have become more coherent on top of the Johnson-McCoy chart. So this, to me, was this is probably the single most surprising thing that we found as we came back to the data, and it's hard to understand. Why does the chart persist? This could be its own study. It should be its own study. I think we should study more of this phenomena in more detail. But one thing that seems clear is that it's become a norm. It's the way NFL teams coordinate. You know, when they make these trades, almost all these trades are made while a team is on the clock. They have a limited amount of time they have to make a pick. Literally in the first round, it used to be 10 minutes. I think it's 8 minutes this year. Is that right, Karim? It's down 8 minutes. Teams will call each other and make offers, and they'll decide in that 8-minute window. In later rounds, it's a 5-minute window. So they have to have some way of making this exchange. They tend to have, they have the chart. So teams now have multiple charts. They have the Jimmy Johnson chart. They have their own chart. And when they get these calls, they have some analyst sitting in the corner of the room, and they bring up the model, and they're calling out the numbers, and they price the trade. And what happens is that Jimmy Johnson chart tells them what the price is. That's the market price. And then they've got their own chart that tells them what their valuation is. And price does not always equal value. Finance folks will tell you this. There can be a difference in price and value. And I've asked these questions, like if you have a pick and you want to move down, teams say this sometimes, we have the number one pick, we don't have a player, we want to take number one, we're looking for sellers, and they'll complain, no one wanted the pick. And that's because they won't sell it for less than the Johnson price. They won't sell it for less than the chart price. They won't accept less, even though their charts say it's worth less. So why don't they accept less? I had this, McCoy says, the standard price list protects you. You don't embarrass yourself, you cover your butt. Nobody gets skinned. Sell it at standard price, you're protected. I had a text thread with an NFL exec last night. He happened to write me. I just came out of this SDS seminar where we were talking about why does this happen? And so I asked him, why does this happen? Why does the chart persist? I know you'll have multiple models. I know your chart says it's not the right price. Why does it persist? This is a screenshot of my phone. Perception. And then I blurred out the names of some people. How so-and-so looked at taking way too little in his first trade. You never want to look like the sucker. The safest way to not deviate from what's gotten the deal done before, which is Jimmy Johnson chart. This is exactly the way we talked about it yesterday in the seminar, and this is the kind of sanction you get from your peers whose respect you care about if you deviate from chart. This is one of the reasons that the price has converged on this seemingly irrational number. Okay, that's one piece of bad news. Second piece of bad news is that the discount rate also persists. About 20% of trades for picks only, don't include players, about 20% include a future pick, a pick for next year's draft, for example. What is the implied annual discount rate if you want to borrow a pick from next year to use for this year? We can price all these things, right? In Massey-Thaler, we found it to be 134%. per year, 134% per year. That's not a 6% mortgage. That's 134%. It's extraordinary. So maybe they've learned this, right? Maybe they've learned this. We found it to be 121 since then. It's barely moved. Some CorpFin folks estimate it to be, quote, greater than 100%. So even on non-sports folks, they dive in. This is an easy thing to calculate. I asked a current GM last summer, I said, you guys know this, other teams know this. Why does it persist such a high rate? It's unimaginable. And he says the desperation is real. He's talking about when you're on the phone with them and they want that future pick of yours, the desperation is real. So those are the two pieces of bad news. Two pieces of good news. Let's look at the value of players. This is one way to look at the value of players. Compensation by position. This is for the top 100 picks, the first 2 days of the draft. All drafted players, so not all of them, some of them wash out, but all drafted players, first 100 picks. And then 4 different levels of performance, median, mean, 75th, and 90th percentile by position. So what stands out? Well, number one, quarterbacks stand out. They're definitely a different animal here. We're doing this because the market is telling us the value of the position. Quarterbacks head and shoulders above at every level of performance. You also see these premium positions. People often talk about premium positions, edge, wide receiver, offensive tackle. Sometimes cornerback gets put in there. You don't often hear that about defensive line. Increasingly you do, defensive line. They're a little bit different. But note also, at the mean performance, in expectation, in the first 3 rounds, the differences are pretty muted. They emerge in some positions, definitely with a quarterback, but in expectation, they're relatively muted. But it does look like there is an edge there if you were to draft based on premium positions. So it's become common in the analytics community to push for draft premium positions. You can get the less premium positions, the running backs, safeties, cornerbacks, later in the not cornerbacks, running back, safeties, tight ends, inside linebackers, off-ball linebackers, get them later in the draft, get them through free agency. So what do we see teams do? This is the difference in draft capital by position across the first half of our observation period, 05 to 13, and the second half of our observation period, the more recent. And we stop at 21 so we can observe players for 5 years. What do we see? Well, I've sorted them from the position that's had the biggest decrease in draft capital to the positions that have had the biggest increase in draft capital. And quarterbacks lead the list, the position that's received the biggest increase in draft capital, first half of our observation period is second, and it drifts down to running backs. Those are almost like canonical. This is what we hear in the literature, the lesser valued position, the increasingly valued position. But you also see some of these premium positions people talk about, cornerbacks, wide receiver, edges. It's not all what you'd expect. The interior offensive linemen, the underappreciated guards and centers have seen a big increase, while their fancier line mates, the tackles, have actually seen a decrease. But the broad trend is a move toward the more premium positions in draft capital, which is, this is what you would want. This is the SDS, just go with base rates. You have a hard time telling which of the guys is going to be best, just pick the category. You know that quarterbacks are more valuable, pick them. You know wide receivers are, on average, more valuable. Pick more of them. That's a class-based prediction as opposed to a case-based prediction. So we see some of that. An example, you see quarterback draft changing over time. We see more quarterbacks drafted. This is a long window now, 35 years. But that's just a count of quarterbacks. If we look at the draft capital invested, the first QB taken, even the first QB taken has grown in draft capital. These days, the first quarterback is almost always the first pick of the draft. And then second, third, fourth, at every level, the quarterback is getting more draft capital now than they did early in the period. So this is good news. The other piece of good news is that the overall number one pick stands out more now than it used to. And it's clear in some of our analyses, and you might not be too surprised, the number one pick in any distribution tends to separate more. The right tail tends to separate more. And then these days, the quarterback is often the number one pick. In our most recent sample, 11 of the 17 years, the number one pick is a QB. It's the most valuable position, most valuable player, showing up number one. So number one now starts feeling pretty different. And for the first time, after years and years of talking about this, I'm going to say, Raiders, you have our blessing. Mendoza, number one, I'm not going to recommend that they trade down, and that is a very different position than Thaler and I have had. Thaler and I were talking about this earlier today. I 100% expected him to give me a hard time about this slide. He did not give me a hard time about this slide. That's a development for us. All right. I've given you bad news. I've given you good news. Now let me give you a little bit of the same news. The same news is about the difficulty of choosing one player over another. So the very first stat we ever ran on this project was, what's the probability that a player picked at a position is better than the next player picked at his position? So the first quarterback versus the second running back versus the third. That's just a test. We figured this is basically the decision that a team faces when they're deciding whether to trade up or not. I could sit here at 12 and take this running back that arrives here, or I could trade up and make sure I get the running back that I want, probably the second versus the third, or the fourth versus the fifth. The difference is typically, the average difference between position, a guy chosen at the same position is 7 or 8 picks, and the average distance traded up is 7 or 8, so it happens to coincide in that way. What we found was across all rounds, it's 52%. This was the big number we started on. The chance that a guy drafted is better than the next guy at his position is 52%. Early on, we talked about they're basically flipping coins in the war room. And it's higher in the first. There's more separation, more discrimination in the first round. How has that changed over time? Well, in the more recent sample, Avery et al., it's 53%. So it's essentially the same. The first round is 58, almost the same. And we can do some robustness checks and find our analysis. You can ask, what about players who were actually traded for? Because not all these guys you're comparing get traded for. But whenever a team goes up to get a guy, does that tell you something about whether he's actually going to be better than the next player at his position? It doesn't. It's not significantly different if he's traded for. What about the fact that the teams that draft early are worse teams? Remember, they draft in reverse order of how they performed. You might worry that, well, they get traded, you trade up, the early guys, they play for worse teams. That's not a fair comparison. You can look at that. Sometimes these better than the next guy cross from the first round to the second round. So you're actually going from a better team to a worse team, and you can compare what difference that makes, and it turns out to be not significant. So you get this nice way to look at variation, not significant. This is something we talked a lot about in the seminar yesterday with SDS. Ran this test, and it came out, it's not even close to significance. We can also look at this another way. Consider the relation between where a guy's drafted and his value when he gets to the second contract, when he finally reaches free market. So look at the rank. Let's look at the rank correlation between where a guy's drafted and the rank of his contract 5 years later when he reaches market value. And I'm talking about the top 100 second contracts. How good are we at identifying and ranking which players are going to be those top 100 players? This is what it looks like over time. It's hard. I mean, it's correlated, but it bounces around between 0.3 and 0.5. But the story here and the point here is that it's not changing. And this is what we refer to as irreducible uncertainty. And we talk about it, I do work in sports betting as well, and there's just, at some level, a degree of uncertainty that you can't get out of. And it begins to look like we've hit that with the NFL draft because we're not improving at this fundamental task. And it's not despite effort. There's guys who are investing considerably in it. Okay, second piece of the same news is policy implications. Does this mean people should trade down? So consider all viable 2-for-1 trades down. This is the last analysis I'll do. All viable 2-for-1 trades down. So if you got the first pick, you could go down to 10 and 11, or you could go down to 9 and 14, or 1 and 18, et cetera. It turns out there's like 61 different 2-pick combinations that equal the value of the first pick. Viable, I mean, somewhere between 95 and 105% of chart, which is where most of the trades happen. So we're going to limit ourselves to those possible combinations. So for example, number 1 pick, 61 such possible combinations. For the 32nd pick, there's 762 ways to go down 2-for-1 there. So we're just going to ask, is it better to take that pick? Would it have been better, historically, to use the pick in the first round, or to trade down and get something from that suite of possibilities? So we're going to use a number of performance measures, and this is what you find, and this is the last data, and this is kind of, we've come to think this is the best test of the whole idea. Because remember, consider what we're asking here. We know the market price. The market price is that curve. and it's really settled firmly on the Jimmy Johnson. That's the market price. Well, let's just ask, at that market price, would you rather be up or down? Would you rather have one pick or two at market prices? If the market is right, you would be indifferent. That's what markets do. So we're going to see, are they indifferent? These are the stats that we find. We try to be as simple as possible. Let's start with the simplest thing possible. Just nothing fancier. Starts, Pro Bowls, or WAR. If you like fancier stats, that's a fancier stat for you. This is coming from PFF. Wins above replacement. It's supposed to capture kind of all contributions a player makes. A lot of observations. And let's talk about the mean difference of trading down. 17, 18 almost extra starts on average if you trade down in the first round. 8 throughout the whole draft. You get basically no difference in Pro Bowls. There's not a big difference. They're relatively rare, and you don't gain anything, but you don't give up anything on Pro Bowls, and you get a little more WAR from trading down. The simpler stat is, what's the probability you do better? We try to make this as simple as possible. The probability you do better if you trade down. Well, according to starts, in the first round, there's a 71% chance you'll do better. Across the whole draft, it drops to 62, but it's still significantly high. Pro Bowls, it's a push, and then WAR, you do better, pretty significantly better. And we can look at other stats, more complicated stats. Performance value using Massey-Thaler or WAR. It costs a little bit more to go down, so we can fold that in, and then we can look at surplus. Massey-Thaler surplus or WAR surplus, looked a couple different ways, and just see what we see. Let's go to the simple one. Probability down is better, just the probability across thousands of possible trades that you could have done, and we're in the 60s. We're hitting about 2/3 likelihood coming out of the first round, and when we're down here in these economic terms, it's even a little higher for the rest of the draft. So about 2/3 of the time, you do better trading down at the fair market price. We take that to be the key test of our idea that teams are not pricing these things accordingly. Okay, so to recap, little bad news. League is more locked in than ever to the chart. Teams pay an unthinkable interest rate for future picks. Some good news, increased allocation of draft capital to premium positions. Using picks on number one quarterback now looks appropriate. That's a development. And then a bit of same news. The uncertainty at the heart of the draft persists, almost undiminished. And teams gain an edge by trading down. I want to end with some closing questions and a prayer for your general managers. And really, I want to put the onus on owners as well. We tend to, I think we put too much criticism of the GMs. Most of this rolls up to the owner. And I want to ask kind of the general question about how you deal with uncertainty. The general managers have to deal with uncertainty. We all have to deal with uncertainty. You have to ask yourself two questions. Can you actually change this? And are you trying to change it? So let's just look at some key elements of the draft and put them where we think we're seeing them. Can you change this? Can you change the probability your pick is going to be successful? So much of the draft industrial complex is focused on this thing. Probability your pick is correct. And we see that it hasn't changed much in the last 17 years. More or less hasn't changed in the last 17 years. And I'm not indicting them for it. It's a really hard enterprise. There's irreducible uncertainty. So I'm going to put it in this cell. You can't actually change it, but you're acting like you can change it. What about other elements? How about the number of draft picks you have? How about the positions that you draft? The number of draft picks, if you trade down, you get more picks. If you're playing a lottery, don't you want more chances? Some teams try to trade down. They try to get more picks. Some teams just going to play status quo, acting as if they can't change it. Some teams trying to draft more premium positions. Some teams keep on going the way they've always done it. Off-ball linebackers, inside offensive linemen. So I'm going to put that in the bin of, you can change this, but a lot of teams aren't trying to change it. And that brings to mind the famous Serenity Prayer from Niebauer, which says, Lord, give me the courage to change the things that I can. This is my prayer for owners and general managers. Give me the serenity to accept the things that I can't, and give me the wisdom to understand the difference. Thank you, guys.
All right. Thank you, Cade, for that fantastic talk. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to switch over to a panel here. So I'll ask Cade if you can join us up here as well. So you're going to be participating with Sam McCrim. I'm going to get this chair out of the way. And so our two panelists coming from great backgrounds with strong CMU connections. First up, we have Karim Kassam, VP of Intelligence at Teamworks. He previously established the data science team at the Pittsburgh Steelers and led R&D for the Minnesota Twins and the Jacksonville Jaguars. Beyond sports, he applied predictive modeling at Legendary Entertainment for films like a personal favorite of mine, Interstellar. It's aged very well as Duolingo. And before entering the private sector, he was a professor here in SDS at CMU and has a PhD in psychology from Harvard University. So let's welcome Kate. And next up, we have our very own Dr. Sam Ventura, VP of Hockey Strategy and Research for the Buffalo Sabres, who apparently are in the playoffs for the first time in a long, long time. So. Sam is an affiliated member of the Stats and Data Science Department, where he does an amazing amount of work in co-organizing with us our annual Sports Analytics Conference. Prior to that, he was the Director of Hockey Ops and Director of Hockey Research for the Pittsburgh Penguins, as well as professor in our Stats Department, where he had previously received his PhD. So let's give a warm welcome to all of our panelists. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing the screen here, so give me one technical moment. We're going to get this display changed. This is when we do it live. There we go. Okay, so we're going to start with Karim, given his experience in the NFL. And so, Karim, if you can give a sense of, from your view, working in the National Football League, what impact Cade's work had, and also just your reaction to the update he presented today, and any follow-ups that you have for him, any questions you have for him. And please, again, use the mic. I believe they're already on.
All right. Yeah, that's good. Impact probably less than it should, and not just talking about the Steelers, like with every team in the league. I think the thing that stands out to me most is the year-over-year interest value. That if you ask someone in any market, there's a market where you could get a 50, 60, 100% interest rate. Would you rather be a lender or a borrower? It feels like one of those one-question IQ tests, and teams fail it all the time. Some of the things that I think are, a little bit different, and Cade makes a lot of compelling arguments. I know you consult with teams, and obviously you have to have a great deal of humility when you're talking with teams, and there's a lot of known knowns and unknown unknowns. And so I wanted to ask a little bit about one of the things you got to at the end, of not being able to discern between two players that are at the same position drafted later. And it seems like the analysis a little bit is saying that we can't tell everywhere that one player might be better than others. But I wonder if there's a possibility that there are tiers of players. Like when I play fantasy baseball and sometimes, or fantasy football, and sometimes I'm like, well, in my second round, I want one of these three receivers. And I might have a preference, but I don't care which one. And if there are tiers, then maybe there are times. I'm putting my football guy hat on, right, and trying to push back against this, because the people that work in these buildings are really smart. As Kate has said, they're really good at what they do. So maybe there are times where it makes sense to trade up for that one player. And I guess if not, then wouldn't you and Professor Thaler say that the Raiders should trade back, because Ty Simpson's going to be available at 10 or 20 or whatever it is?
Well, it's an interesting feature this year that there's not a compelling second quarterback. So this is the easiest year to say knock yourself out, Raiders, because if people were arguing about Simpson versus Mendoza, we would say trade back, like let somebody else choose between them. There have been years that have been like that. So Rodgers and Alex Smith came out the same year, and there was a lot of debate which way the Niners should go. And if it's that close, given how much uncertainty and the difference in value of the first pick versus the second, I think you should let go. So that's acknowledging that there's circumstances that vary, and it's not just a quarterback. There are teams will definitely see these tiers. They'll say there are two great wide receivers, there are two first-round wide receivers. This year, there's no more. And look, if you got to have a wide receiver, you're not going to get him somewhere else, and you believe that, then of course you sometimes bet on yourself, for sure. we're talking, these are probabilities, right? So if you have confidence that's sufficiently strong to offset that base rate, act on it. But you better be right about your confidence. You better be calibrated about your confidence. Well, I can't say no one, but I know that it's difficult. But I think your general point is maybe we can go tiers. Basically, this, Krim. They'll have grades on players, and they'll have, say the third highest grade. I call it a C here. So C's. They might have 4 or 5 C's, and then they'll rank the C's. And by God, they'll spend some time ranking the C's. And if we're going to talk about tiers, we would say, yeah, great. Pay different amount for the tiers, but then don't worry too much about within tier.
All right, so next, I'll turn it over to Sam. So from the interesting perspective that you're coming at it from a different sport, right? Sam has this rich, extensive experience in the NHL. And so we'll get your thoughts on how does this work? Does it at all carry over into how the NHL draft operates? Because I personally know nothing about hockey, so I don't know how the NHL draft works. So I'm curious to hear your perspective on this amazing insights you had from the NFL, and any thoughts you have, also questions you have for Cade, your reaction.
Well, first of all, I think there's a lot of similarities between the NHL draft and the NFL draft. First of all, the conversations that you two are talking about that go on behind the scenes are almost identical to the ones that we have. It's a 7-round draft, and maybe the similarities don't go too far beyond that, because the key difference is, and I was, like your first slide, Kate, you're talking about the portfolio of picks, the drafting for players on your roster, drafting for players maybe to, think about your roster a year out. It's very, very different for us. Like, we're looking 5-6 years down the road, right? We're drafting 17-year-olds with the hopes that 5-6 years from now they might make our team. Whereas, you guys are drafting 21, 22, sometimes even older players with the intention that they're going to fit this specific roster spot next year. And so that is a very fundamentally different problem that we have to deal with, and that's definitely the biggest difference. Kate, I guess I kind of fundamentally don't believe that this is the irreducible uncertainty. My job kind of depends on being able to. So you had the probability that the pick would be a success. We want to increase that, right? Like, my job kind of depends on that being true. So I'm going to challenge you a little bit. So on your podcast, you talk about a lot about non-stationarity, right? And so I would submit that your chart that was evidence for this ended in 2021. And I'll tell you, my observation is that after COVID, when a lot of hockey scouting, we weren't allowed in buildings, and so you couldn't get live viewings on players. There was a lot more reliance on video, and certainly a lot more reliance on data. And what I noticed was across the league, teams started drafting off of lists that were pretty similar to each other. And what I mean by that is that before that time, the players that were selected were not super correlated with the order of our list, internally. And after that time, the correlation went up a lot, and that's anecdotal, I guess, but I feel pretty confident in that. So what I would say is or I guess what I would ask you is, as we theoretically, if we were getting better at drafting over time, particularly since data became a bigger part of it around 2021, and maybe Karim can speak towards that in football specifically, does that not change the way the intrinsic value, draft pick value curve looks, right? So if you're better at projecting players now, you're going to make fewer mistakes early, and therefore the value of early picks goes up, and therefore you should trade more to get those early picks. I'm wondering if it's actually rational now. There's 17 assumptions that I threw in there, but I think it sort of checks out in my head, and I'm curious for your thoughts on that.
Well, the concept of motivated reasoning, Sam, right? Sure. So that we have to keep that in mind always. But I agree. I want it to be reducible as well. And really, big picture, long term, I think it's reducible. We're going to get a little bit better at it. But the amount that we invest in getting better relative to some basic strategies you could take to exploit the uncertainty, as opposed to just reduce the uncertainty, I think it's out of proportion. In most clubs, it's out of proportion. You're proposing, I mean, you had me at non-stationarity, and you knew you were going to have me at non-stationarity. You can always sell me on non-stationarity. You're saying the world's different after COVID. It's a really interesting story you're telling. By the way, baseball says that about what happened over time, is that used to teams' lists were pretty uncorrelated. Now they're just rock, solid correlated, and teams are having a hard time finding the edge. And it's interesting to hear that that's emerged in hockey as well. We haven't seen it yet. We haven't seen it through the 21 draft. And again, it's not just that one player over the other. Look at the broader correlation of where the top 100 players are coming from. That correlation is not changing. It's not changing for a 16-year period of time. And so the chance that it's all of a sudden going to shift, it seems unlikely to me. But look, we've never put more into it. Technology's never been better. They've never had more people working. The people like you have more say in front offices than they used to have in the past. So I remain optimistic. My main lesson, it wouldn't just be about the NFL draft, it's about uncertainty in general. We invest too much in changing probability of correct, and not enough on these strategies around it that would just accept uncertainty and adopt your strategy accordingly. But by all means, let's continue to have scouts and analysts and try to get it right.
At the end of the day, you might have gone from 7 picks to 8 picks by trading back, and you still want to maximize probability of success. Right. So I do think it's still a rational thing for me to work on to try to increase that probability, but point taken. Yeah.
Well, no, there's always the potential. There's so much more. You're working with stuff that guys weren't working with 5-6 years ago, much less 20. So there's always that potential.
Well, and to be honest, if you look at some of the early papers, so like our mutual friend Michael Schuckers wrote one of these, and a few other people in hockey, like the early papers about using the data that was available to project draft eligible players, the data that was available really did not change from the 90s until like roughly 2020. Okay. So I don't know if that's true in football. Maybe Karim can speak towards that, but right around 2020, 2021 is when we started getting really high quality data on amateur players. Okay. So I don't know.
Say for football, it changed around 2010, where before then it was all box score stats. So, how many rushing attempts, how many passing attempts, completions, receiving yards, and then Pro Football Focus and other companies that got really detailed event level data starting around 2010. So that was like a little bit of a step change. And then, it's similar to hockey where now we can apply computer vision to college data and understand where everyone is on the field 10 times a second and really understand player movement in different ways. So that started around 2021. So probably 2 big steps, but it's still changing very quickly.
Well, Karim, you're on the front lines of technology and player evaluation in football. What's your level of optimism for getting better P-correct, probability correct in player evaluation?
It's still really hard. And so at Teamworks Intelligence, we have some overall like WAR stats. We don't really lean on our WAR stats. And I think partly because if I'm saying what's the wins above replacement for most non-quarterbacks, it's going to be like half a win plus or minus 3 wins, right? Like it's not baseball where if I'm playing third base for the Yankees or the Red Sox, I'm playing the same position. Like teams are asking different things from their tight ends, from their tackles, from their wide receivers. So it's very difficult that way to say, what is the skill set that's really going to be important here? That ends up being hard. And because I don't have that number, it's hard for me to say like who's exactly, like the right player to pick. I think we're getting better and better. And I think what we have now, I think the top end analytics tools, like the types of stuff that we develop, can help a lot in later rounds. Like typically what happens in football, I'm not sure how it is in hockey, like a top 10 pick, this year people are talking about a little bit of as like a weaker class, but typically like a top 5, top 10 pick, everyone in the building is gonna love the guy. He's gonna look like, like a freak from another planet. The production stats are gonna be off the charts. The speed, the change of direction, whatever we can analyze the movement, everything's gonna be off the charts. When you get later round, I think we can start to see hey, this is a player that has some specific traits that suggest that they might make it, even if they have some flaws. So to give an example, there's a player drafted in the 7th round last year by the Buccaneers named Tez Johnson. He's a receiver. He's very fast. We had him as, he ran like a 4.5 on a 40-yard dash, which for a receiver is kind of average, but we had him playing faster. We had him incredible change of direction, very good ball skills. He happens to be 5'10", 160. You know, so there's a reason he's not a first-round pick, and because football is, I'm 5'8", 150. I've been told many times it's a big man's game. I believe it. You know, it's very hard to do it. But here's a player that had this upside, and we could see these traits from tracking data, from computer vision, that this player has some traits that maybe you can make it. And in other ways too, like the NFL has a scouting combine where everyone does standardized drills, right? Like this is the SAT for college. Everyone's in the same environment doing the same things. But with the data now, we can see better how fast players play from their actual games than what we get from that combine 40. So even though it's on the level playing field there, when we look at games, players are starting from a football stance rather than a sprinter stance at the combine. They're wearing their full equipment, which matters. We notice that smaller players will run better 40-yard times because they're relative to their play speed, because taking off 20 pounds of equipment makes a difference, more of a difference if you're 160 than if you're 210. So I think we have a lot of ways to find some more of these hidden gems. I don't know that. Yeah, I'd like to think so. I mean, in my role, I feel like I want to tell teams that we do, but to know who exactly is, you know, the best quarterback, or, you know, this year's draft class with a couple of really good edge players, like which one is the best one, I don't know that we're any better than we were 10 years ago.
Just add one thing before you jump in, that you've basically said the data are categorically different now, even though data changed in 2010 in football.
Yeah.
They've really changed again in the 2020s. And
Yeah.
And it maybe this revolution will change your ability
And
to
orders of magnitude, right? So from 2010 to 2015 was probably an order of magnitude, and from 2015 to 2022, another 2 orders of magnitude more data.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. You said something that echoes our data. One finding I didn't have time to present, but I just discovered this, and I think it's interesting. Reliable difference in the first half of our window versus the second, and identification, the reduction and the ordering of guys who never make a second contract. A reliable difference in misses, essentially. So they've improved misses. It's like the base rate of missing in the draft is like 20%. Like 20% of the guys never see a second contract. Maybe this is in the top 100. Maybe I think that's the whole draft. 20% base rate. And that's 15% better, so like 3% better in the second half than it was the first. So they're identifying the washouts better, maybe through some of this technology.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, I think with the last so many minutes we have here, we'll open up for questions from the audience. So if you have a question for either Kate or their panelists, all right, we got a hand up, and we'll walk with the mic, and I'll just ask that you please speak clearly into the microphone.
Professor Massey, I had a question on when we're talking about the increased allocation to premium positions. Does that assertion not hang on the assumption that NFL gameplay has remained constant throughout your observation? So instead, we know that the player selection is not efficient, but what if the allocation to different positions is efficient?
Yeah.
And it's just a function of how gameplay changes over that observed time.
Yeah. So it's moving for sure. So quarterback, I showed you changes in valuation first half to second half. So it's like quarterbacks go up the most, cornerbacks went up the second most. So we know that that's a dynamic. Games changed. Running backs were it in the 70s, right? They're not so much it anymore. And so we haven't done the analysis where we showed, is the league, are they tracking that change? You could look at the relation as player valuation, position valuation changes. Does the priority in the draft go along with it? We only look at it two parts. And in 2 parts, it does kind of move that direction. So it's hard to say whether they're doing it better than that or not. I'm open to the fact that it is. I mean, quarterbacks are just more valuable now than they used to be. I mean, the game is differently enough, so it's rational to move that direction. Are they moving fast enough in that direction? I don't know. We don't have that analysis.
Another hand in the front.
So I'm very interested in the sort of normative advice you've given about wanting to trade down in this sort of classical received analytics wisdom. One thing I'm concerned about in our estimates, this is maybe a bit of a Lucas critique, but the statistics that we see according to the historical data say, okay, this is the amount of surplus value you would get if we traded down at the market price. Well, what trades we observe is, that's not a random sample. There's a selection bias there. We see that clearly teams really want to hold on to their picks, and that's sort of what we would expect from like a endowment effect type of situation. They're expecting 100% interest rates to go into the future. They're expecting excess returns from moving down from a top slot. And so the trades that we see are only going to be the ones that, the team that wants to move up is really offering us a lot. And so statistically, when we just see the trades that happen, we would see, they're getting, huge prices in order to move down. But if we go and say, you should move down to all these other teams, in general, well, they might not always have those same offers, right? And so what I'm concerned with is, like, on average, historically, trading down has been great. But at the decision margin that teams are facing when I'm on the clock, I have certain offers, maybe they're not at the market price, we can't just sort of be giving the carte blanche to teams and just say, trade down, because if you try to start doing that, well, you might not be able to get.
That's right. It's not a complete market in that way. People often want to trade down and don't get a phone call. I mean, our critique would be they're not offering at a lower price, and they could have more offers to move at a lower price. But we don't observe. We don't know where that delta is. Like, if they just offered a little bit less, would they get it? It's just not a fluid enough market to know. So,
I could tell you for a fact that cuts in both directions. So we have many times turned down overpayments or offered overpayments. And so it's on both sides of the, whatever that bid price is. So, yeah.
That's interesting. So the reluctance to trade is not always the absence of offers. Sometimes you get lots of offers and they don't trade anyway. So This is the idea that, we're not just criticizing those who trade, we criticize those who don't trade despite having this price. And Sam's telling us that exists. Yep. Interesting.
And we have time for one more question.
I love this, hearing about how the data is improving, and it's clearly this story of a lot of data versus this kind of individuating, I want this particular player. And I'm asking this question as an opportunity to bring Robin Dawes back into the picture, because he would always tell these stories about, you have all this great data and you have a candidate, you know exactly what to do, and then you interview them and your decision gets much worse because that just overrides all the data you have. And I kind of wonder if the draft being this big event all about the people, if that tips it, is that part of what makes that so powerful to ignore all the data and focus so much on, I gotta get that guy.
So I'll pose it to these guys, because I spent some time in buildings, but these guys have lived and worked in buildings. And so they're the data guys, right? But I bet even they feel it some. But they sit in the middle of it and they watch these guys fall in love with players. And they watch these guys debate the minutia of players. And there's nothing a scout wants to do better than debate which of two guys is going to be better. And they do this for months. And by God, they have an opinion by the time they're done. But I'll defer to these guys on answering that question.
I know you have a paper on kind of mechanical aggregation of scouting grades. You referenced a little bit, and it made me think. When I started the Steelers, our draft meetings were usually in April. We probably do 3 weeks, 7 days a week, 12, 13 hours a day, normal. And one of the things I'm proudest of is that I helped change our IT systems to make those faster. And instead of 21 days, we probably got it down to 17 days and a couple hours less per day. And when you think like head coach, GM in that room, like that saved us $1 million a year. But what your question is posing, what some of Cade's work is saying is that all of those draft meetings were a waste of time. And maybe we could have just averaged the grades and gone from that. But I don't know if that's true.
Please don't put those words in my mouth.
Let me give you a theory of mind with a little bit of hand-wavy math to answer your question. So let's suppose that I'm arrogant. Of course, I'm not. I'm perfect in every way. So, but let's suppose that I'm arrogant and that I run a hockey team. or a football team. I believe that I am better at drafting than 90% of the other teams, maybe 80% if I'm being a little humble, but probably more like 90 or 95. And if I'm right about that, then similar to what I was saying to you before about the non-stationarity, my curve, if I am a better projector of talent, looks different from the market value curve. And in particular, it's steeper at the top. And so if I believe that, then, so I mean, there's the hand wavy math, by the way. That's not 100% true, by the way, but we can debate that. If I believe that, then it is 100% rational for me to make that trade. And that is, I think, for a lot of organizations, what's going on behind the scenes is I think I'm better. I think I'm certainly better than everybody was 15 years ago, and I think I'm probably still better than most of the teams. And there you have it. You have a rational decision at the end of that line of thinking.
But they don't test the rationality by actually looking at the data to see whether they are better. Or if they do look at the data, they'll say, yeah, that was in the last 10 years, but we've improved, and so those data aren't as relevant anymore.
Yeah, a lot of confirmation bias that makes it hard to learn from these.
And look, they're like everybody else. They are us. And in our faculty hiring, we do the same thing, right? It's the human condition.
All right, and I think on that note, let's give a big round of applause for our panelists and our speaker, Cade Massey. Again, this was a wonderful collaboration between statistics, data science, and social and decision sciences. And as a thank you to Cade, he gets his own Carnegie Mellon Sports Analytics Center pullover. All right, and thank you all for joining us online as well, and have a great NFL draft weekend in Pittsburgh.